Hi, my name's Kirstie Page, and I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to speak at this amazing conference organised by the Stronger Practice Hub and their team. What I'm wanting to do this morning is to focus on the fundamental importance of identifying gaps in children's development as early as possible, and the importance of really trying to tackle and close those skill gaps as much as we can with our youngest children. And I'm wanting to talk about the fundamental importance in two ways, to be honest. The fundamental importance for the children, but also the fundamental role that you play as practitioners, leaders, and teachers within the early years. So let's have a think about it to begin with from the child's point of view and how we interface with that as adults. And really, I suppose the greatest gift that children can be given is the fundamental gift of life, and then also the very crucial things that go with it: the need for food, the need for shelter. And of course, beyond that, there is the gift of love. But one of the most fundamental gifts that we can give children, which we often don't talk and think about quite so much, is that gift of facilitating the development of communication and language skills. And of course, we need to nurture and facilitate that development so that children can learn to talk. But what I want to do at the minute is explore in a little bit more detail how crucial and fundamental that gift of communication and language is. But before we explore it a little bit more from children's point of view, I really want to say right from the start how fundamental your role is in building these skills with all children, but also particularly with those children who are finding development in this area trickier than others. So let's go back to the children. And we don't often think about that correlation between communication and language and personal, social, and emotional development, because in the early years curriculum, we compartmentalize them out and talk about them as two distinct areas of the curriculum. Whereas in reality, we can see that communication and language skills pervade the early years curriculum, and that as we interact and develop communication and interaction skills, and then later on build language skills with children, we're also establishing those attachments and bonds with those children. And as children are able to give feedback, as they're able to respond to us, as they're able to initiate interactions with us to share what they're thinking, what they need, what they want, then those attachments and bonds are furthered. As well as nurturing, establishing and maintaining and developing bonds with adults in their world, those very same communication and language skills will allow children to develop peer interactions, skills to interact with their peers, which will in turn allow them to move from solitary play to parallel play to collaborative play, which is a very tricky level of development. And then eventually those bonds with peers will become friendships. And within friendship development, it's also correlated with emotional development, but my communication and language skills will be intrinsically linked with that development of emotional skill, in that I will very much need to develop an understanding of my own emotions as a child, and that is much deeper than just being able to label happy, sad. It's about understanding the complexity and the different range of emotions, but also to be able to communicate with people about how I feel and why I feel that way. And dare I say, when things are really problematic for children, to develop, to have the ability and the capability of being able to say when something is not right, when somebody has said or done something damaging to me as a child. So here we see that communication and language is actually a safeguarding issue as well. But as well as understanding my own emotions, and this is crucial for that development of peer bonds and friendship, is I need to have that ability to begin to understand the needs. Well, first of all, I need to be aware that other children are there, that it's not just me, but then I need to move on and develop the understanding of the needs and then the emotions of other children, and how I fit in with that, and how those needs and emotions need to correlate with my own actions and behaviours. And again, we think of that as a PSED issue, and it is, but this is all about communication, particularly pragmatic and social communication skill development. So we see that children with certain types of communication and language skill gaps can actually really find development in the area of PSED pretty tricky. We also don't often think about the correlation between language and play. By supporting communication and language, we are actually also supporting play development, because we can see that language and play really correlate together within early development, and that particularly certain types of play are underpinned by central language processes. And on top of that, playing in that way further develops and nurtures those core language processes. And certainly if we look at certain types of play, particularly pretend play, role play, creative construction, where I'm not just fitting bricks or blocks together, but I am purposefully building something, where I'm using those creative skills, and more conventional creative play, be it Play-Doh, painting, drawing, we can see that those types of play are underpinned by internal language processing, but also in turn nurture those language skills further. So when we're thinking about children in early years, we can often watch them within our learning environment, and we can pick up children who maybe have a more limited repertoire of play, and we can begin to think, right, I need to look at that child more closely, because their limited repertoire of play might be underpinned by a language skill gap, which is manifesting in their play as well as their ability to verbally interact with myself as an adult. So as well as helping me pick out the children who I need to look at more closely, it's also great because once I realise I've got children who have got skill gaps, then I can understand that by nurturing and facilitating those play skills within the learning environment can be one of the most powerful and productive, and dare I say the most simple and easiest way of closing that skill gap, a way of me embedding interventions into my practice. And sometimes I think we don't see that actually teaching children how to play, teaching children how to utilise our learning environment is a fundamental part of our intervention as we move away from this concept of intervention being something separate, something isolated, where children have to be removed to do a specific activity. It's actually all about our practice. Of course, language development is intrinsically linked with learning. And there's an organisation, a Canadian organisation, but which actually works internationally, called Hanen. I used to be a Hanen accredited speech and language therapist, who have this fabulous phrase, which I think is really useful, so I will pinch it here. And they talk about how fundamentally important it is for children, first of all, to learn to talk so that they can then talk to learn. And it's through those interactions and through those conversations in the give and take of everything that we do with children that allow children to learn about the world around them. So let's explore that a little bit more here. So, of course, when we're thinking about language in the curriculum, we need to see that language pervades the whole of the curriculum, really. Dare I say, except physical development, although there often is a strong correlation with children with delayed development and disordered development and language and physical, but we could say that it doesn't pervade that. But certainly all other areas, we can see that language is intrinsically linked across the curriculum, and that although we have that separate prime area of learning, we shouldn't just be thinking about speech and language as something to do with communication and language, and speech and language being something to do with literacy, and that's it. Of course, communication and language has to do with those curriculum areas, but it's much broader and wider than that. And outside of those very obvious links, we've already talked about that intrinsic link with PSED. A lot about mathematics is about that conceptual understanding, having that auditory memory to kind of hold information, having the ability to understand you when you're talking to me and explaining things to me. Of course, we've talked about kind of literacy, that goes without saying, but also when we're thinking about understanding and learning about the world around me. And that's all to do with our interactions and building language development. So as well as it being kind of cross-curricular, I think we also need to understand how, when we're talking nowadays about the fundamental importance of building knowledge with children, that we can't think about building knowledge without thinking about building language skill. When I learn about a topic as a child, when I build my knowledge about that topic, and then when a little bit later on, I can tell you about what I know and what I've learned. I can't do any of those things without language development. The storage of language is all about building knowledge. So I need those language skills to process what you're saying as you're teaching me about something, to process those words, to process those sentences. I need those strong semantic and vocabulary skills to add those new words to words that I already know, to link them together so that they stay in there, so I retain that learning. And then I need those vocabulary skills again, along with expressive language skills and speech, to be able to tell you about what I know. So this idea that we can concentrate on building knowledge without thinking about language processing, language skill, and the importance of skill gaps and the impact that they will have if we don't think about them, is false economy, because it's one and the same thing. So let's have a think about our role and how we can kind of move that on and enhance that. So let's start with kind of more generic kind of early years advice and practice, which is fundamentally important, but we're often talked to and read a lot about the importance for quality interactions, and that is such a crucial layer of our practice, but also a crucial and most fundamental layer of any interventions we embed. However, what I find is unless we kind of move on, everybody talks about having quality interactions, but what is a quality interaction? What does it need to sound like? What does it need to look like? And do you know what? That will depend on who you are talking to. What is that child's skills like? What are those? What are those child's skills like? What gaps do they have? How do I take those into consideration? And when I'm thinking about that, that's when my interaction can become really high quality and match the child, so that I really need to move away from this one-size-fits-all notion that the same interaction strategies will be good and high quality for everybody. That's not the case. We also have that generic advice about having language-rich environments. And although that's important that there's lots of language and talk in our environment, it's not as simple as that when it comes to children with skill gaps. We need to be mindful about where a child is in their development. How much language can they tolerate and process? When would too much language be actually not as helpful as we think it would be? So that actually language rich doesn't mean that we should just talk lots to children, because actually for some children I need to be more simple, to focus on interaction, to say just little short chunks of language and leave gaps in between. And for me to talk lots to those children would not be as productive as I think it would be, because I would actually be saying too much and surpassing the skills that the child has, and surpassing the next steps that that child needs. And another generic piece of advice will be the fundamental importance of our learning environment. And within that, I include our daily routines. And again, that stands, you know, a quality learning environment is crucial because that quality learning environment creates opportunities for your children to develop certain skills. And as an adult, it creates opportunities for you to add certain words, to model certain language structures, to develop certain other key skills. So again, really to move on to that next level, it's not just your learning environment needs to look like this, or your learning environment should have these things in it. That might be where you start. But to really move on, we need to be looking at how we interface with that learning environment and how we interface differently with that learning environment depending on the child or the children that we're interacting with. So we've talked a little bit there about moving on to the next level. What do we need in order to truly move on to that next level? And I think the biggest thing that we need, and everybody talks about this is kind of central to the new EYFS curriculum, is we need subject knowledge. And I'm not talking about extensive subject knowledge of maths or history or geography, although a little bit of that can be useful. I'm talking about subject knowledge of children. And I think even in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, people need to know more about child development, period. But certainly in the early years, yes, we're delivering the curriculum, but our true subject knowledge is children and child development. So as well as knowing about broader child development, of course, the area of child development that we particularly need to know a lot about, and it's not that we don't need to know about the other areas, but because of the pattern of skill gaps that we find in children out there, the area of development that is particularly crucial is the area of development which we entitle speech, language, and communication development. Now, we talk about speech, language, and communication development as if it's just one thing, and it's really an umbrella term for quite a few different skills that come together under that umbrella label. And so our subject knowledge means that we must understand what are the different skills that make up speech, language, and communication development, so we can move away from thinking about it as if it's just one thing, so that we know what those different skill areas are. And we also, really to move on to the next level, need to have an idea about how these skills develop, but also what stages of development would we be expecting when children are 2, when children are 3, when children are 4. And that age-related expectation, that understanding of stage of development compared to age expectations, is not because we're going to expect all of our 4-year-olds to be there and to teach them as if they were there and to ignore their skill gaps. That fundamental importance of stage and age is a really crucial thing because it allows us to think, well, where should we be really expecting our children to be? And in an ideal world, where would we like them to get to? But the most fundamental thing that that understanding gives us is the ability to identify gaps so that we understand where children should be. But when a child is not where they should be, that mismatch between stage and age allows us to begin to identify gaps, and that is crucial. So by understanding more about child development, and as we move towards understanding more about gaps, then this is not about then saying, right, okay, let me then take those children to one side and do something separate, to do some intervention activities, and then we'll carry on just as we were. As I upskill myself to understand more about child development and understand more about the gaps that my children have, I need to be thinking, right, how do I build these skills through all layers of my EYFS practice. And when I'm thinking about layers of practice, you know, early years isn't just about the activities that we deliver to children. That's an aspect of our practice. But we've got those fundamental layers of practice, which we've already kind of mentioned. So we've got that fundamental layer, which is the interactions. How do I build these skills with all of my children? How do I differentiate my interactions? Now I know a little bit more about the skills that my children have and my children need next. How do I really use and make the most of those opportunities within my learning environment and my daily routines to work children towards their next steps? And how can I create additional opportunities within my focused opportunities to build these skills further? So that could be, how do I weave it into my existing story times, song and rhyme times? How do I weave it into my phonic preparation sessions? How do I weave it into this little group where our focus is actually on mathematical learning? And of course, how do I maybe do some little focus opportunities to specifically target a certain skill with certain children, because I've identified they've all got a commonality of need. So we've talked about your crucial role, and this is crucial for everybody, but your crucial role is even more important and even more fundamental when it comes to children with skill gaps. Because as well as knowing more about child development, within that upskilling and understanding of child development will give you that ability with the right tools to be able to identify and address children's skill gaps. And we really, really, really need to be doing that as early as possible. We don't want to be waiting for reception. We don't want to be waiting for these things to cause problems in key stage 1. I often used to talk about what is an initial language need will morph into a learning need if we don't address it. And a lot of these kind of gaps that present in the early years, if we ignore them and don't address them, then they will end up with that child becoming labelled with a SEND label, which they might not necessarily have had if we identified and did something more about that skill gap right from the beginning. So I'm not talking there about children with specific and identified kind of medical SEND needs. I'm talking about the children who initially fundamentally had a language gap, but because we haven't identified and addressed it, it's become a learning gap, which then goes on to be identified as a specific developmental need, when actually maybe it could have not been. So this is a crucial role as well, because this is not just 1 or 2 children. The need to identify and tackle gaps in the early years covers lots of children, and certainly the figure that is widely accepted and used is that 50% of children will present with concerns in this area and will not be meeting age-related expectations. For some of those children, they'll have delayed development, where simply they're developing as expected, but their stage does not match their age. And it could be because progression is slow, because that's the way they're developing. It could be that they were late getting started, so now they're making good progress, but they've still got to go through those same processes. Or it could be that we're seeing disordered development. And this is where child development might not necessarily follow that same usual pattern. There might be an unusual order of development. It might be that the child's got really spiky, unusual developmental profiles, and that they've got what I call patchy development. So for some reason, they can do skills that are harder, but then they've got more fundamental gaps missing underneath, which is topsy-turvy, and it doesn't make developmental sense. Now, all I will say is that even if a child doesn't have the most kind of sought after early years and home experiences, a lack of input cannot create disordered developmental patterns. So again, if you're seeing developmental disordered patterns, then our concern levels need to be higher, because that hasn't been anything that has been caused externally. So again, delayed, disordered, we've got that kind of developmental predisposition that some children have to delayed or disordered development. It might be that their delayed or disordered development is associated with a more complex need, which may or may not have been medically recognised or diagnosed yet. And of course, there is that kind of really fundamental importance of, well, what early experiences to develop those early language and communication skills? What experiences has this child had? But of course, remember that a child can have what I would call a double whammy, and that's not a professional term, but the child could have a developmental predisposition. The child could be presenting with disordered development, and on top of that, you could also have concerns about the amount of interaction and language enrichment that goes on at home. So they have both issues going on, but it doesn't mean that we can completely blame the early experiences and the home. We need to be really mindful that there's a little bit more going on with this child. And we also know that children who have had fabulous early language and interaction experiences at home can still also present with delayed and disordered development. So as well as thinking about your crucial role of identifying gaps, that is so important. When you're establishing gaps, it's not just, oh, they're not where they need to be with this skill. It's then about understanding the gap, not just saying, oh, they've got a gap with that. It's about saying, okay, they're not meeting age-related expectations with this skill. But if I go back using my incremental understanding of child development, I can establish the child's level of success. Yes, they can do this. Fab. And if I understand what they can do, then I can think about, well, what does the child need to do next? And by weaving this upskilling and understanding into our targeted practice, this is where we can talk about our practice not just being good early years practice, it's targeted practice. And that within that targeted practice, we weave in this notion of embedding interventions. And that is so crucial. As well as identifying and tackling gaps as early as possible, this is so crucial. Not just so that we can move children on to being able to speak to us and to be able to speak to each other, although that is a bonus and a thing that we're working towards. This is bigger than that. And this is what I want to end by saying. This is about you allowing each child that you work with to reach their potential. And by really upskilling yourselves to understand child development, to identify and tackle skill gaps as soon as possible, what we're ideally doing is preventing these gaps from getting wider and wider and wider as children get older. And that is where things become really problematic for children. And I'm going to leave it with just going back to your role. And I'm going to say that, so if anybody, like some people used to say to me when I was a speech and language therapist specializing in early years, and particularly they used to say this to me when I taught in the early years later on, all you do all day is play. Actually, what we're doing is, yes, we're playing sometimes, but we're not just playing. We're identifying, we're nurturing, we're facilitating child development, we're tackling children's skill gaps. And on that base of development and gap filling, everything else that is taught in Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, and Key Stage 3, everything will be built on that firm foundation. So if anybody ever says that to you, that is what you need to be telling them that you really do all day. Thank you. Enjoy the conference.